Media Enterprises. We are the worldwide community empowerment group where we speak life into the community. Log on to WCEG Watch us live on your smart TV, on Roku, cable, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and now we're on Fanbase, Blue Sky, and Twitch. Y'all, you can find us everywhere. Search for WCEG and subscribe, like, connect, and follow us on all social media platforms. I'm Melanie LaGrone. I am an attorney, and I'm your host today of Beyond the Border. For about the next 20 to 30 minutes, we are going to talk all things immigration. So you can download our free WCEG mobile apps. Say, Alexa, play WCEG Talk Radio. Listen to WCEG on any of our 11 podcast distribution platforms. And last but not least, our disclaimer. The topics and opinions are those of the show hosts and any guests that we may have, and not of WCEG Media Enterprises Incorporated. Thank you all for your continued support. All right, so let's get into it. All right, we've got immigration updates. The last time that we were together, I had an awesome guest who talked about human trafficking and all the things that they were doing in that area with his nonprofit. It was very impactful. It was awesome. We had some great questions. And today we're going to shift over a little bit, and I'm just going to give you some immigration updates so that you all, the audience, can know what is really happening in the immigration space, what that crazy man upstairs is doing, and how, if this affects you in any way, if you're an immigrant or you're a family, is an immigrant, or, you have family, friends, or whatever, you kind of know what's happening right now and how to navigate the space. So I'm sure all of you know about the firing of Kristi Noem, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary. And a lot of people were asking, obviously we know, she wasn't all of that honest. She was very, her methods were not, on the up and up. But at the end of the day, the crazy thing about that is, I mean, who nominated her in the first place? Who already knew about her tactics and methods and things like that? Who already knew about how she was going to navigate this space? But anywho, he decided to fire her, and I'm sure he decided to fire her because at the end of the day, the extreme of what has been going on is making him look bad, okay? And as much as he wants immigrants out of the country and all that type of stuff, he still, cares a little bit, in a, narcissistic kind of way on what people, what I'm saying, think. So he fired her, and that's fine. She is being replaced by Oklahoma Senator. His name is Markwayne Mullin. Not quite sure what he's going to bring to the table. It still sounds like that he's, all about enforcement and, but I know that there was some like interview or meeting or something like that where he said that he was going to reverse some things that Kristi Noem did. So we'll have to kind of sit tight and see how that's going to play out. But what is so interesting is I had watched one of the Senate Judiciary hearings, and the one where they were just kind of like drilling Kristi Noem. And it was recently, I think it was like the beginning of March or something like that. And I've never seen anybody be able to just go on and just blatantly lie after lie after lie after every question that's being asked. I remember watching Senator Cory Booker ask her about, U.S. citizens being arrested. Oh, we don't arrest U.S. citizens. Or, asking her about little children being detained and being arrested. And she just kind of blatantly said, oh, that they're not doing that either. And we all know the massive arrests that are happening, and they are including us, our US citizens, and they are including kids. So it was just interesting to see how somebody could just basically go on there and say whatever they want to say and try to, I guess, convince the public that it's all true. But anyways, who knows what's going to happen next? Hopefully, this Senator Mullins gentleman is not as, obviously we know he's going to be aggressive, but hopefully he's not as, I don't know, dishonest, just maybe dishonest and maybe deceitful. And maybe there will be an actual plan in place for, what is to come for immigrants. Because as you know, or as you've heard, you know, President Trump has said, "Oh, we are going to detain, the violent criminals and those that have convictions and so on and so forth." Well, the data has shown that out of all of the arrests that have been between, I think, 25 and 26, the ones with violent criminal convictions have only been about 5% of the public. The ones who have had non-criminal, so no criminal convictions whatsoever, are at about 73%. So obviously higher than those who have had criminal convictions. And the most common ones are the ones that have had traffic offenses, nonviolent arrest, and immigration offenses. And I can understand the immigration offenses because what happens is when you go through the immigration process, if you already had, let's say, maybe a removal, like a deportation order, or let's say you had a voluntary departure that you didn't take, you didn't leave, then those are considered immigration offenses. So at the end of the day, you kind of had your opportunity in immigration proceedings and you didn't cooperate, you didn't adhere to what you were supposed to do. So ultimately, yes, I could see and understand on that front how some people can be, deported because of the immigration offenses. But traffic offenses, you guys, come on, driving without a license. Well, we all know that you can't get a license unless you have an immigration benefit either pending or you are a current, green card holder. And nonviolent offenses, usually we're seeing things like theft, forgery. I think those are, I want to say those are like the top ones that like come into our office. Sometimes there's like some domestic violence and batteries, but those are considered more of a violent offense because it's it has somebody else involved. But, and then thefts and forgeries, they are considering those as crimes against moral turpitude. So ultimately, it means that you're dishonest and that, you shouldn't, be trusted because of your dishonesty. So, but traffic offenses, I beg to differ on that one because most of the time it's, somebody is driving without a license. So, all right, let's move on some other updates. TPS update, so temporary protective status. So, not too long ago, we got together and we spoke about how temporary protective status for Haiti and Syria and some other countries were halted from being, so basically they're not protected from being terminated. And apparently, it is now at the Supreme Court to where there's going to be an expedited hearing to in the to hear arguments on terminating TPS, so temporary protective status for Haiti and for Syria. Those are the two right now that are up at the Supreme Court. Affects, roughly like 350,000 plus individuals who currently have temporary protective status, as well as, their work authorization. So they have, some sort of legal status to be able to stay and to be able to work in the United States. My understanding is that the hearings are going to take place late April and that there's going to be some sort of decision by end of June, maybe early July. So it looks like by end of June, early July, we will know if temporary protective status for Haiti and Syria is terminated or if it, is going to still uphold. we're hoping obviously that the Supreme Court, and that the people on the Supreme Court, do the right thing, because at the end of the day, temporary protective status means that you are protected from going back home to your home country, because there is something there that is not, you can't live a fulfilled life. Like, you can't live, even, maintain like a sense of, livelihood, meaning that there's, either gangs rampant, or the government is just out of control, the living conditions, it could be national disasters, things like that. But that is what TPS is for. And the only time in the world that we terminate that is when those conditions in this person's home country are back to what they were previously. So prior to getting TPS, or almost, to the point where they're in the conditions where, prior to TPS. As we know right now, Haiti and Syria still are not, in a state of, they're still in a state of emergency. They're still in a state of upheaval. They're still in a state where, individuals who are there, are going through a lot of, stress and issues and things like that. So we will see, but looks like end of June, early July, we will have a decision. And this affects, even with my practice, we have a lot of Haitians in my practice. You know, we we don't I don't we don't have I don't think we have anybody from Syria, but we do have a lot of Haitians, and we do understand what they're going through. And one thing that we found that is nice is that if TPS is terminated, and um, the immigrant, so the foreign national from Haiti, has a legitimate asylum claim. So, in other words, they're saying that they personally cannot go back to Haiti because of persecution against them. So, not what's going on in the world, or not what's going on in their country, but actually because of persecution, against them, their family, anything personal, then we can file an asylum application, even though they've been here for so long, because usually asylums you can only file within 1 year of coming to the United States. But we can file an asylum application and move through immigration proceedings with that application. But once again, I do want everybody to understand that USCIS and the government, they're putting their foot down on asylum applications. Nowadays, you cannot file just a blanket application and say, oh, I don't want to go back to my home country because, we don't have food, or we don't have water, or something like that. They are immediately putting you in removal proceedings, and they're doing something called pre-termit. So it's like pre-termination. So DHS can ask the judge to pretermit this application, meaning it won't go to an individual hearing. You won't get your time, your due process per se, in front of an immigration judge, because they see that your application is just the bare minimum. So, with that being said, understand that if you are filing asylum applications, that they have to be a complete application. It has to be because there's persecution against you in particular, your family, your loved ones, your business, something like that. And you have to have the evidence. You have to have, information regarding maybe like country conditions, like all of the things to make that packet really look good, so that the government does not want to, or does not want to try to, preterm it, your application in immigration proceedings. But that is an option, and it is an option if TPS gets terminated for Haiti or Syria. All right, so let's move on to, now this is interesting. So in Virginia, there was a bill that was passed, and it's going to limit, well, it wants to limit law enforcement cooperation with Immigration and Customs, so with ICE. So, in other words, it's going to put like a constraint on any sort of agreements between local and state law enforcement and ICE. So, in other words, you know, this whole wearing of facial mask is going to be prohibited. Um, you're not able to arrest immigrants in certain spaces. Local and state municipalities, they can't, let's say, if they're going to agree with ICE, there's going to be some sort of requirements to that agreement. Like there's going to be some conditions to that agreement. I think this is awesome. It's going to give some oversight. It's going to give some transparency into, you know, how ICE operates. Hopefully, it will, you know, eliminate all of this mass free for all because I feel like that's what it is. You know, what we've seen in Minneapolis, and you know, it's like just a mass free for all for people just to act however they want to act. So hopefully, it will, you know, put some conditions and eliminate, you know, this kind of upheaval and uproar. I say that I know it's Virginia and we're, you know, in Georgia, and but understand that states follow each other, right? So if Virginia, you know, can get this passed, it's already a bill, so you know it's got to go up the chain. But if Virginia can get something like this passed, then other states will follow. And then, you know, each state will be able to have their own bill with the same sort of, you know, agreement and conditions and stuff. So let's hope that that moves forward because that would actually be awesome. All right, big thing is the government shutdown. So the Department of Homeland Security shut down, and how does it affect immigration? And that's a lot of, you know, what we've been hearing a lot of is a lot of questions because people want to know, you know, what's happening with their applications. You know, are they going to be able to, you know, leave the country and go to their home country to consular process and have their interview and be able to come back to the US? So here's the breakdown of what the shutdown actually means. So it's been over, I think, what, over a month or so, or a couple months now. And for USCIS is funded by your fees. So your application fees that you pay to USCIS, that's how they're funded. So they don't really have there's no really impact on the government shutdown. That means that they're going to continue with processing applications. They're going to continue with their interviews, naturalization, you know, things like that. Although we have had some naturalization interviews canceled, ironically, but I'm thinking more of it's because of, you know, the country that the person is from versus, you know, not having staffing or anything like that at USCIS to do the interview. But that's, you know, that's a whole nother episode on the whole country pause thing because it's still in effect and we still are feeling it. So USCIS petitions are still processing. The Department of Labor. Now, the Department of Labor is who handles like your employment type of visas, your employment type of green cards, your H-1Bs, your perms, your labor certifications. E-Verify is suspended. Now, although E-Verify is suspended, employers still have to move through the process of, you know, the I-9 eligibility and things like that before they hire somebody. But E-Verify is suspended because of the shutdown. The Department of State. So the Department of State is the consular processing department. So in other words, if you have to go, either if you have to leave the United States and go back to your home country to have your interview there, or if you are already in your home country and you have to have your interview at your consulate or your embassy abroad, those petitions are delayed, is from what I'm understanding. So they're not just totally canceled, but there's going to be a delay. So in other words, you know, what may take usually, you know, a year or 2 years to get approved, maybe, might take longer. So just understand that that is how, this government shutdown is affecting immigration and immigration petitions. Now, as far as immigration courts, the non-detained docket. So those are individuals who are, just living their life. They're going about their business. They're not in custody. That docket may be delayed. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because they're not locked up. So they're still, with their family. They're still, if they're able to work, they're still working. They're still able to live here in the United States, not be deported, or anything like that. And so it makes sense that docket could be delayed or would be delayed because it really doesn't affect their livelihood per se. However, the people who are detained, so the individuals who are still in custody in immigration proceedings, their cases are still going to move forward. So they're still open, they're still moving forward as usual, and there shouldn't be any sort of delays or effects from the government shutdown for detained cases. Now, that is pretty much the update that's happening right now in immigration proceedings or immigration, worldwide. Um, the other thing is for my people, my friends, my family, my clients, their friends, their families, all that type of stuff who are down in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It looks like the enforcement down there with immigration has really, really, really increased. I saw a video recently with immigration officers on St. Croix, and they were in front of the Jiffy Mart down there. And the Jiffy Mart is like our Home Depot. So, in our Home Depot here in the States, and they do it down in the Virgin Islands too, but Home Depot in the States, right? Immigrants usually hang out around the, Home Depot parking lot because they can pick up side jobs, they can pick up extra work, they can pick up work. And the Jiffy Mart on St. Croix is kind of similar to where immigrants will hang out in that area so that they can be picked up for work, whether it be, construction, whether it be things in the field, whether it be, restaurant, whatever it might be. And what did ICE do? ICE went to that location and they pretty much wreaked havoc on that area. So I say that to say, if you are on island, if you are in St. John, St. Croix, St. Thomas, Water Island, wherever you are, understand that ICE is now there. They were there before, but it wasn't so, I think, intense. But they're now there, and they're now, going to the spots where immigrants hang out. So you definitely want to, protect yourself. You want to protect your family. You want to make sure that you don't get caught up in any of this craziness. Also, too, one of the things, and this is for everybody, this is something that I always tell you, you know, in my shows, I tell you in my videos, I tell you, posts from my law firm, all of that type of stuff. You want to be prepared. Right now is all about, and I will say this until I'm blue in the face. Right now is all about preparation. Preparation meaning this is happening, so you can't just stick your head in the sand and pretend like it's not. So since you know this is happening, you need to be prepared for your family. So that means that if you have any children who are US citizens and you are undocumented or you are in the process of, getting a green card or your petition is pending, so you still are undocumented, you want to make sure that your children have some place to go and somebody to turn to if something happens to you, if you are put into removal proceedings, if you are picked up and put into a detention center. Because here's the thing, and this especially down on island, but it could be here too in the States. We don't know where they're taking them, unfortunately. I have no idea, and I'm going to be working on finding out where they're actually taking all of the detained people. In Georgia, we know that they take them to Stewart, which is down in Lumpkin, Georgia, but ultimately they can then be shipped out to another state because Stewart is getting overcrowded. So, with that being said, you might not even know where your loved one is gone. You just know that you know, they didn't appear, they didn't pick up their kids from school or something like that. So you just want to make sure that your children have somebody, you have somebody in the United States that you rely on, somebody that you trust to have their birth certificates, to have their school information, that person's name is, in the school as a parent or guardian that can pick them up if necessary, or if any thing medical happens or anything like that. You want to make sure that you personally, so if you are the immigrant and you are undocumented, you want to make sure that someone that you trust has all copies of your documents, your passport from your home country, your birth certificate, anything health related, anything like that. Just think of important documents, okay? Make sure that someone that you trust has those documents. And obviously, make sure that if you had been in contact with an immigration attorney maybe prior to all of this, and maybe, you haven't retained them yet, or you haven't hired them yet, just make sure that someone in your family that you trust has their information, their telephone number, their name, so that they can immediately call them when a situation like this arises. We actually had a situation similar to this, to where the family had just hired us, and they hired us for something else, and one of the individuals got picked up and detained by ICE. And so, luckily the whole family had our information. They could call us and figure out strategy wise on what we are going to do next. If it's a possibility, if this person can get out of ICE custody, can they get a bond, uh, you know, strategy. So you want to make sure that everyone is prepared, that you are prepared, so that you don't get caught blindsided. It's almost like, um, I always talk about, because, I do criminal cases as well, right? And so, I had someone, call me, and it was regarding, an alleged outstanding warrant, right? The person, thought that they might have a warrant for their arrest. And, I explained, well, at this point in time, what you need to do is you probably need to turn yourself in, and then we can figure out how we're going to, proceed in the court, after that. And I said, because if you think that you have an outstanding warrant, you probably do have an outstanding warrant, and you could get picked up just driving down the street. And I kid you not, oh my gosh, it was like literally 3 days later, his family is calling us because he got picked up simply driving down the street, and they ran his plate, and he had a warrant. So that stuff that you have to, when I say you need to be prepared, or you need to follow the advice of an attorney, then that's what you should do to make sure that you and your family are safe, and you and your family are, protected for, for the most part, until something else, strategy wise happens. All right, you all. So that is my update. That is immigration that's happening right now. When we get additional information, we will definitely let you know. I will do, and I'll probably do some videos on the pauses, and maybe on my next show next month, that will talk about what is happening with all of these different countries that have either, pauses to their processing, or they've completely, canceled their processing altogether, because the list is very long and extensive. And I think, some countries have been added, some countries have been taken off. But a lot of people have wondered, what does this mean, and how does that impact my petition? I say this to say, um, do not, I'm going to do a negative. Do not file your petition because you're in one of these countries, or because the family member that you're trying to bring over is in one of these countries. Because at the end of the day, this too shall pass, right? And you don't want to be left out there filing, at the time that this passes, because guess what? Everybody is now going to be filing, and now your petition is going to get delayed because now there's a mass filing. Whether, versus, my clients, we are still filing petitions. We're still moving forward as if there's no pause, because they're in line. So when this ends and is lifted, now their petition is going to continue to be processed, and they're going to be ahead of everybody else. So don't stop. We have questions where, people have asked, what do us as Americans do if they're being harassed by ICE? The problem or the challenge with that is is, you know, because they're wearing masks, right? And so, and I'm sure they don't have names, I'm saying, on their vests, like police officers and ICE officers usually do, and everything. So it's almost like, well, what can you do? I say you don't put yourself in a worse off situation. Okay? Don't fight them. Don't combat them, you know, because as we've seen in the news, how you could potentially lose your life, what I'm saying, because of this. So it's not worth it. It's not worth it. At the end of the day, if you are harassed by, I answer their questions, or if you are a United States citizen, right? I'm a US citizen, and I am not answering your questions, or I refuse to answer your questions, or I'm going to maintain my right to, to be silent, whatever it is. Understanding, though, that you might still get taken to jail, because that's what they're doing. They are still arresting Americans. They're still arresting United States citizens. So I just say, don't escalate it, because it's not worth your life. You can get out of jail. You can get out of immigration custody, but you can't, come back from, you know, being, unalive. So just go with it and do whatever you need to do to stay safe. Do whatever you need to do to make sure that you return home to your family the next day, or if you get arrested, in the next couple days. But don't escalate it, because right now we don't know who these people are. And you know these aren't, I'm going to say, well, these aren't real ICE officers. Come on. These aren't real public servants. These aren't real. I used to be the police. Okay. I know that we have rules that we have to abide by. And these aren't those people. Okay. These are just simply, vigilantes who have found an opportunity to be hired by, the government to be able to wreak havoc on the world, like something that they probably wanted to do all of their lives. And now they get that opportunity. So do not escalate it, and just do what you have to do to make sure that you go home. Okay? And that's my biggest advice. If you don't take anything from my show, please take that. You need to do what you need to do to make sure that you go home to your family the next day. All right, everyone. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I am attorney Melanie LaGrone. My law firm is LaGrone Law. We are located in downtown Lawrenceville, Georgia, and also on St. Thomas, the U.S. Virgin Islands. You can reach us at 678-250-5449. If you're on island, you can reach us at 340-626-0778. We are on all social media at LaGrone Law, and you can visit our website at www.lagronelaw.com. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I know this topic is one of those that is very intense and, can be, pretty sad. But at the end of the day, I just want to give you this information so that you can be informed, so that you at least know how to navigate this crazy world that we're in right